but you've written more books about Armstrong and others. Tell us a little bit about some of the other books.
Well, my dissertation is in 15th century music, French music from the Middle Ages. So there you go. And my first book was on late medieval music. But in graduate school, I got into jazz also quite a bit, and I worked with a professor very closely. So then, in 1997, I published a book called Louis Armstrong in His Own Words. And the way this came about was when his widow died, Lucille, in the early 80s, it gradually became known that Armstrong had written a lot of material and saved it. And so all that went to Queens College, and then gradually in the 90s, it became available to scholars. And so we decided to do an edition of his writings. And so I put together 19 documents of his writings and called it Louis Armstrong in His Own Words. And so while I was doing this, I was trying to write about what he had written, try to contextualize it. And I realized musicology had completely ignored this material, had ignored this period. I mean, so I decided I was going to work on New Orleans and Armstrong's early life in New Orleans. And so the book that I wrote next was called Louis Armstrong's New Orleans. It was the first book by a musicologist on the early period of New Orleans jazz. So it's kind of amazing to think about that.
Let me jump in here and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Lee Wright. I'm the founder of History Camp, and behind the scenes tonight is Carrie Lund. She is the executive director of the Pursuit of History, and we are bound and determined next week she'll be with us on screen. But she's the one who has put this whole series together, including inviting Thomas Brothers, who's our guest tonight. He is a professor of music at Duke University, the author of Help, The Beatles, Duke Ellington, The Magic of Collaboration, Louis Armstrong's New Orleans, as he was just explaining, and the topic of our discussion tonight, Louis Armstrong, the master of modernism, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Thanks for joining us tonight, Tom. Congratulations about the nomination.
Oh, thank you. It's wonderful to be here with you, Lee. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So I love the title of your most recent Armstrong book, Master of Modernism. I think many people may know of Armstrong as more the popular character from things he did later in life, maybe even Hello, Dolly. Give us an idea of Armstrong's role early in his life in the creation of jazz.
Well, yeah, it's a big story. But so basically, Master of Modernism covers the period 1921 to 1933. And during that period, and we could even narrow that a little bit to say from 1925 to 1933, Armstrong was the man. So if you were in jazz, if you were trying to make a career in jazz, you knew about Louis Armstrong. You bought his records, you studied them, you memorized them, you imitated them, you tried to personalize his style, but you paid attention. So he is the cutting edge figure in solo playing during that period. And that's what the book is about. Yeah.
Well, let's go back to the beginning. And I think here we benefit not just from this book, but from your research on your other books also. Give us an idea of what it was like in New Orleans at the time and his early life, which was difficult to say the least.
Right. So he was born in 1901 in New Orleans, and he left New Orleans in 1922. And during his early life in New Orleans, it was rough. I like to say that he was born on the impoverished margins of society, but at the same time, that put him at the center of a musical culture, of a culture that valued music extremely highly, more than anything else, really. So he grew up surrounded by music, really immersed in it, total immersion. And that's what this book is about, Louis Armstrong's New Orleans. It's about his musical education. So a lot of people thought that he was self-taught, just a natural genius. It all just came out of him. But my book is about all the different kinds of exposures he had, the different mentors he had, the different trainings he had in church. It started in church. He said he learned how to sing in church. Then it went to blues. Then it went to popular music, and eventually, by his mid and late teens, he has a toehold into a sort of professional culture in New Orleans, and he's making his way up in that. So by 1922, when he leaves the city, he is a fully formed professional.
And tell us a little more about his growing up, between parents, grandparents, home for wayward children, this sort of thing.
Yeah, he moved around a lot. So the first 5 years of his life was spent with his grandmother. His mother was out of the scene. His father was out of the scene. He loved his grandmother very much. It was a very happy existence, I think. And then he went to live with his mother around age 5. She was sort of there, sort of not there. He had connections to family and to neighborhood people. But he was also a bit unsupervised, I would say. And he was very engaged with musical culture on the streets of New Orleans. And there was a lot of music on the streets of New Orleans. You know, if you go to New Orleans today, there's a lot of music there today on the streets. But we're talking about homemade music by local people, for local people, almost every single day. There was something going on. So he was basically roaming around, connecting with this kind of musical culture. For one thing, he told a story about a guy who had a little wagon that was drawn by a mule, and his routine was to blow this horn, and he blew a certain jingle on it, like an ice cream truck, and all the children came running with their little bit of scraps and bottles and things that they would give to him, and he'd give them this tiny toy, and then he'd recycle the stuff. So Armstrong started helping him, and he said that this guy gave me lessons in blues, that he played blues on that horn. And we know that there were a lot of guys like this, actually. This was a very part of the street scene of New Orleans. So when you think about blues in New Orleans, it's so important, and it's so important for the musician who Armstrong became. And here he is, around age 8, 9, getting tutored in blues by this street musician. I mean, it's a kind of education that can be missed in history. I mean, there's no written record of it, except all we have is Armstrong's report of this, and then we have parallel reports from other people about the same kind of phenomenon. So that's the kind of thing that he was able to connect with.
Help us understand a little more. Put this in the context of jazz. So we know, of course, the repeated, jazz, the true American art form. Give us an idea of what jazz was like as Armstrong was a young man, as a child perhaps, and then how that evolved and how he helped the music evolve with it.
That's a big question too. I think of this story as having 3 important ingredients. Number 1 is the movement of people from the plantations of Louisiana and Mississippi in the post-Reconstruction years into New Orleans. Now, as many of your listeners today may know, Reconstruction was a tragedy. The collapse of Reconstruction was a tragedy. And that gave rise to one of the most oppressive periods in this nation's history. I mean, we're talking about lynchings and all kinds of things, sharecropping that's highly exploitive, severe conditions. This was a period when a lot of people moved from these plantations into the cities of the South, especially New Orleans. Some 40,000 people moved. And what did they bring with them? They brought with them blues culture. They brought with them the tradition of ragging the tune, which becomes ragtime with Scott Joplin, becomes jazz in New Orleans. And those people settled in the uptown section of New Orleans. Armstrong's mother was one of these people who moved from the plantations. His mentor, Joe Oliver, was one of these people who moved from the plantations. Dozens of musicians he knew had been born on these plantations. So this is extremely important. The second thing is New Orleans itself. In New Orleans, all of New Orleans valued music a lot. And all of New Orleans valued a sort of public musical culture with parades. So parade culture in New Orleans is very famous. Obviously, we all know about Mardi Gras. But in this period, around in the first decade of the century, there were parades all the time. I mean, there's always some minor holiday or some lodge celebration or some funeral with music. This is extremely popular now. And so Armstrong could hear all that music. There's a lot of things. There was a big semi-professional musical culture in New Orleans, performed by African Americans. Doesn't get paid much. It's kind of exploitive, but that made lots of room for youth to enter into the musical scene in New Orleans, actually, which is exactly what Armstrong does. So he's immersed in this culture. The third ingredient in the making of jazz is what we call the Great Migration. And I'm sure many of your listeners tonight are familiar with that. This is the movement of African Americans from the South to the North, beginning after World War I, when immigration from Europe is reduced because they're afraid of communism, basically. And so the factories in Chicago suddenly have a huge need for labor, for cheap labor. And African Americans in the South respond. New Orleans has a direct train that goes from New Orleans to Chicago. As Danny Barker said, one of the musicians from this period, there wasn't any place you were going to go other than Chicago. Everybody was going to Chicago. There was no place in between. So you have a huge community that is resettling in the south side of Chicago, African American sector of Chicago. And what happens there is equally important because the musical culture of New Orleans becomes intensified and it becomes professionalized and it gets connected to vaudeville and it gets connected to professional theaters and it gets connected even to classical music. All these things are happening in Chicago in this African American community that is just flourishing, full of opportunities, full of optimism in the 1920s. Armstrong is part of this Great Migration, and there are maybe 40, 50 musicians from New Orleans in the 1920s there with him in Chicago. So it's a huge community, and what they do becomes really important for the history of jazz. That's part of an answer to your question, anyway.
So we know of Bix Beiderbecke as one of the early jazz greats. Help put us in the timeline here of Armstrong and Beiderbecke and what Armstrong did in New Orleans and then his trip to Chicago.
Well, let's see. So Beiderbecke is from the Midwest. Beiderbecke actually, by the way, claimed that he heard Armstrong play on the riverboats. So that's part of his training. That's actually a professional job that he got from New Orleans beginning around 1918. These excursion boats would leave New Orleans and travel up the river, and they would stop at every little port. Musicians would get off, they'd play a little concert, they'd get back on, and they'd go on to the next stop. Beiderbecke said he heard Armstrong playing at one of these things, like 1919, 1920, or something like that. Anyway, by the time Beiderbecke gets established in the mid-20s, he, like a lot of white musicians in Chicago, they understand that what Armstrong is doing is very, very special. And they are totally fascinated with this. And they go to these black dance halls and they sit, and the stories about them riding their bicycles, because a lot of them are teenagers, not Beiderbecke, but these others who are with him earlier. They ride their bicycles from the suburbs down to the black section of town, and they sit right in front of the bandstand, and they just soak it up. And so this is part of the transfer of jazz into white culture. These musicians have the opportunity to hear this kind of thing, and Beiderbecke certainly listened very closely to Armstrong, 1927, 28, and picked up his style, and like a lot of people, transformed it, made it his own, personalized it, and became a great player in his own way.
Well, one of the things we wish we could do tonight would be to drop in some musical interludes here to illustrate some of these things. In the absence of being able to do that, help us understand folks who may not be that familiar with Armstrong's music or that period, the kinds of things that he was doing that were so innovative and that really moved the music ahead.
So we don't have anything recorded from the recordings come from Chicago. That's that's part of this commercialization of the music. They're stepping into an industry, a pretty well-organized industry in Chicago. And we have what is the phenomenon that's called race records. In beginning like 1920, 21, all the major record companies established a race label, a special color label that was marketed for African-American audiences. African-American musicians playing for African-American audiences. They're a low-budget label, if you like. And this is how we have all these recordings from the 20s, including King Oliver, Jelly Roll Morton, and Armstrong. And beginning in 1925, Armstrong established a series in Chicago called the Hot 5 series, and then later the Hot 7, 5 musicians followed by 7 musicians. And this Hot 5 series, which goes 25, 26, 1927, 1928, then it's finished. This is one of the most celebrated series of recordings in jazz history because it's on these recordings, one after the other, that Armstrong is demonstrating and just growing. It's an amazing thing to sit down and listen to these in chronological order. You can just hear him maturing and expanding and trying things out. It's incredible. So it's from this period we have the early famous solos, Big Butter and Eggman, Strutting with Some Barbecue, Potato Head Blues, West End Blues. These are some of the famous titles from this Hot 5, Hot 7 series. In this series, the focus is on him. It's Louis Armstrong and his Hot 5. They're selling records based on him. They're not selling records based on the tunes that they're covering. They don't care, actually. Record companies, actually, the one thing they say is, you guys create your own tunes because we don't want to pay royalties to someone else who has created a popular hit. We don't want to have to do all that. This is low budget. So the point isn't in the tune, it's in the solo. And so these solos, they are faster than anybody else. They are bigger range than anybody else. They're more beautiful tone quality than anybody else. They're more precision in chords and scales than anybody else. The surface is just dazzling. And they have tremendous creativity and tremendous melodic sensitivity. Armstrong is developing as what I call a great melodist, one of the greatest melodists in the history of American music. His solos stick with you. They have shape, they have interest. You can listen to these recordings, people do, again and again and again. It's like the great classical music, Bach, Mozart. I mean, you never get tired of it. It's so rich and so complex and so rewarding. These solos are like that. They're so intricate and beautifully made, beautifully designed, melodically designed. It's got the whole package.
Yeah, now, I believe that Louis Armstrong and the Hot 5 and Hot 7 were very popular groups at the time, right? And the recordings were popular also, I believe. Was his exceptional talent recognized, though, at the time? It was certainly, there was a lot going on, right? A lot of people playing, a lot.
So during this period I'm talking about right now, 1925 to 28, the Hot 5 period, he has a regional reputation. He's famous in Chicago, not much else. I mean, occasionally a radio station will pick up something from Chicago and that will spread the word. Occasionally he'll do a little tour to Wisconsin or Indiana or so-and-so, but not a whole lot. So, and by the way, this is mainly within the African-American community because these records are marketed to African-Americans. Whites don't really buy these records during this period. That comes later when his reputation starts to spread even further.
Well, talk to us about that, because at some point he moves from Chicago to New York, I believe. Talk to us about how that transition and how his reputation grew.
The first move to New York is in 1924-25, 1 year. He plays with Fletcher Henderson's dance band, jazz orchestra. It's a very different kind of ensemble. And they are playing in Midtown Manhattan, and they're playing at a fairly nice dance hall, whites only. So there's a shift for him to begin with.
If we could just, Fletcher Henderson was one of the major band leaders at the time. Is that correct?
African-American band leader, absolutely. And he will become even more important in the late 20s and 30s. Then he goes back to Chicago and establishes the Hot 5 series that we just talked about. Then the big move to New York is in 1929. And with that, he becomes established as a singer on records, and he steps into a Broadway show, which is called Hot Chocolates. The music is written by Fats Waller, the great pianist, comedian, performer, singer, Fats Waller, composer. Wonderful talent. And Armstrong steps into this show. He's playing in the pit, and they have this idea he's going to stand up in the pit and sing Ain't Misbehavin'. It becomes it takes over the show. Armstrong's version of Ain't Misbehavin'. Record companies are paying attention. He's on Broadway. I mean, this is getting noticed. And so from there, we have a different phase of Armstrong's career. I call it his second modern style. The first modern style I call the Hot Fives, Hot Sevens. The second one is this second phase that starts in 1929. And what it's based on is paraphrasing the great popular songs of the day. So as I mentioned, the Hot Fives, not so much repertory based. The second phase, totally repertory based. And so we're talking about the great recordings of Dinah, When You're Smiling, Rocking Chair, Sweethearts on Parade, and the great peak of this period, the recording of Stardust from 1931, which is one of the great glories of jazz history, Armstrong's version of Stardust. So in this period, what you hear is Armstrong paraphrasing the tune that you already know because it's so famous. Just like a lot of jazz paraphrases famous tunes, great singers, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, all these great performers, they're doing the same thing. Armstrong created a way of doing it that was very innovative, very dramatic, actually, and very witty and very beautiful. And what you hear is you hear him in dialogue with this popular song. You hear this back and forth between the popular song as you know it, the straight melody, and this sort of dazzling display of invention and wit and brilliance. Scat is a big part of this. And he's doing this on these recordings in voice and on trumpet. Similar kinds of procedure in both. So this is when he becomes known throughout the country. And he starts to tour the whole country so that by 1932, he has become the best-selling recording artist in the United States of any kind of music. So this is a huge transition, huge opening up to the entire market of the country, and I call it the second modern phase.
Fascinating. So two questions. One is, to what extent were other musicians taking popular tunes of the day and improvising with them? Or was that something that was especially notable for Armstrong? And then second, 1929, 1932, we know about what happened economically in the country at the time. What impact did that have on Armstrong?
Yeah, so the idea of paraphrasing a popular tune, this is not the first time Armstrong has done it, but this is the first time he's featured on records doing it, and he's featured on Broadway doing it. So that platform is what lifts him into this bigger market. He had been doing this forever. In fact, African Americans had been doing this forever. On the slave plantation, that was like the main thing. You took the famous tunes and you did your own version of it on violin or perhaps singing. And so there's nothing new about it. It's called ragging the tune, on the plantations. And so it's an old thing. Armstrong just did it so brilliantly and so daringly, so dramatically, and with this melodic craftsmanship that he's now pouring into this kind of technique. So yeah, very good question. In terms of the Depression was huge, obviously, for music. And we go from basically vaudeville and recordings to the Depression. Vaudeville basically disappears. It gets replaced by movies, basically. Movies are the ascendant art form. Movies are a lot cheaper to go see than a live vaudeville show. It's just that simple. And the recording industry shrinks dramatically to a bare fraction of what it had been in the 20s. So when I say that Armstrong was the best recording and most biggest selling recording artist in the country, that's of a greatly diminished market in 1931-32. So it's a big change in the music industry.
And what about radio at this point in spreading his reputation?
Sorry, yes, I meant to say that. So recordings are in the descent. They didn't disappear, obviously, and radio is in the ascent. Radio, obviously, a lot cheaper to engage with than recording. So yes, and Armstrong did do a lot with radio in the 1930s. So beginning, I don't know, certainly in the early 30s, he's playing a lot of gigs in California. He plays for the summer of 1930, I believe it is, 3 months. And he has a gig there, an extended gig, which is always wonderful for jazz musicians when they can stay in the same place for 3 months. That's an amazing thing. And that venue had a radio hookups. And now we're talking about the national radio hookups, by the way. So NBC, CBS, they date from this period. And so you're broadcasting from Los Angeles, but you can be heard all over the country. And so that becomes a standard feature of what he does in the 30s, absolutely.
And the recordings at the time were very short, I believe, right? The nature of the record, whereas radio being live allowed them a chance to stretch out. Is that correct?
That's true. That's true. Yes. Recordings are usually 3 minutes. So, but dances were 3 minutes too. So it's not necessarily that they were that far out of sync. So, I mean, in a live performance, yes, you could stretch out, and there are lots of reports of. And when you stretch out in a live performance, that's where someone like Armstrong could show off his improvisational abilities. So, how many choruses can he go? And it's still new, every single chorus. This was a matter of showing off a little bit, and Armstrong knew how to do that. That was something that was built into New Orleans, into the scene in New Orleans very much. This improvisational ability to just generate a lot of new ideas. Improvisation is regarded as a source of personal power and a source of interpersonal power. Improvisation in dancing, improvisation in all kinds of things.
Talk to us then about Armstrong as we go through the decades. And at some point, he moves from being a musical figure to a figure that's better known even in popular culture. I mentioned when we opened here talking about his role in perhaps Hello Dolly, bringing him mass exposure and so forth.
Yes, well, that's how most people know him, of course. So, my work in these two books that we're talking about is on what I consider the formative period of his life and the most important musical period of his life, where he's the revolutionary, he's the historical figure that you cannot take out, and is the dominant historical figure. But of course, his career carries on until virtually the last day of his life in 1970, 71. And he becomes a celebrity as much as anything, a singer that people know. They know him as a trumpet player, although his embouchure is weak and he doesn't have the same kind of abilities that he had before. He also was in tons of movies and people knew him through that. But in the 1950s is when his popularity really soars. And in the 1950s, he's in dozens of movies, and he establishes the Louis Armstrong's All-Stars, which become a major force in American music. They're extremely popular. My mother saw the Louis Armstrong All-Stars in Minnesota in like 1953. It's that kind of exposure all over the country. And from there, he just becomes an international figure. He's one in the late 50s, 60s. He's one of the most famous people in the world, really. And there's a tremendous sense of charisma and magnetism that jumps off the stage. And so this is no small achievement. when I say that I'm interested in the 20s and 30s, I don't mean to disparage what he does later. There's a lot of beauty in that material, and I mean he's wonderful. He's wonderful, but it's not exactly the same kind of historical situation.
Let me add one point to that, and then we'll start asking if there are questions. We already have one. He also served as something of an ambassador, didn't he, for the United States, traveling to other countries?
Yes, the State Department of the United States organized tours of Africa, of Eastern Europe, of various places, and got jazz musicians to go on these tours as quote unquote goodwill ambassadors. The idea was that the Soviet Union was hitting pretty hard on the apartheid of the United States and trying to win the soft war, swaying these nations against the United States. And the United States, well, let's put some of our goodwill cultural ambassadors on display. And Armstrong was one of the most successful. He took a number of tours of these. And that was part of his international fame, certainly. Yeah, he was extremely popular in Africa, in all over the place. Yeah.
You know, it's an interesting contrast and kind of surprising one between his extraordinarily difficult childhood and the ebullient person that I think everyone knows him as, right? Just a source of joy, right? A source of delight, bring kind of smiles to everyone's faces. One particular question: how much influence did Buddy Bolden really have on Armstrong?
Oh. That's a great question. So Buddy Bolden is the first great famous player in jazz who had a regional, local reputation in New Orleans, a trumpet player, cornet player. And he in 1906, 1907, he had, I guess what we'd call a mental breakdown. He spent the last 20-some years of his life in an insane asylum. And so that was the end of his career, 1906, 1907. He's peaking in the late 90s, 1898, something like that, and going through 1906. Armstrong said that he did hear Bolden play, and it made an impression on him. I think probably the significance is not so much the direct influence as the kind of things Bolden was doing on his horn that established normative styles for this community about basically playing blues on wind instruments. So that was one of the things that Bolden did. He played blues on wind instruments. When you think, we take it for granted today, but in 1898, that was a novelty. We hear a cornet player playing blues. And Bolden became famous doing that. He also brought church things into his dance hall repertoire. Church tunes, spirituals, a church feeling, people said, oh, he sounded like a preacher, this kind of thing. So in other words, the plantation culture that I was talking about before, Bolden is bringing that into the dance bands and bringing it into wind instruments and making himself famous doing that. That is what gets established. That's what Oliver did the same thing. And Oliver is the one who's transmitting all of that to Armstrong.
You know, Buddy Bolden's certainly a sad case, and one's reminded of the horrific situation with mental illness in that time, and not understanding, and options just not being available, and people being locked away. Tremendously sad. On a brighter note, if someone wanted to really understand Armstrong and understand his impact, what are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 records or albums? What should people be listening to understand Armstrong and his greatness that you've studied?
Well, you can easily find compilations of the Hot Fives and Hot Sevens. I still listen to CDs, believe it or not, but there are many of greatest hits of the Hot Fives and the Hot Sevens. I would start with that. And then I would go to the 29, 30, 31, 32 big band sound. I Can't Give You Anything But Love, Ain't Misbehavin', Rocking Chair, Dinah, Sweetheart on Parade, and especially Stardust, as I mentioned. Those things, any compilation you can get that has those things on it, you're going to love it.
And in terms of Armstrong in New Orleans or Chicago or New York, is there a museum where somebody could go and learn more?
Yeah, there is. The best place to go is the Louis Armstrong House in Queens, New York. So when he married Lucille, I think it's in 45, something like that, she was from Queens, and she wanted him to buy a house in Queens. And that would be his anchor. So he'd go out and tour the world and come back to Queens. And she'd be there. And so he lived there in that way for almost 30 years. And today you can go visit that house, and it's a wonderful, wonderful visit. And they've got a really nice setup, and you can see his den where he had his tape recorder, and you can listen to his tape recordings, and you can get all kinds of insights into him. In New Orleans, there's not a lot that survives from his lifetime. Although there are exhibits that the National Park Service actually has a nice little jazz museum in New Orleans.
Really?
That is wonderful, really wonderful. And they give tours, so you can see the few things that are remaining that he would have known, that kind of thing.
Very interesting. Well, Tom, this has been great, and what a treat to have someone who has written not just a book, multiple books on Armstrong, and for us to be able to learn so much. We have a link to Tom's book in the chat, and I'm not sure if we have a link to just the most recent one that we've covered or to multiple ones, but obviously it'll be easy to find all of them. We'd like to thank James and Edith Spain Foundation for supporting the Pursuit of History. To find out how you can join as a member or support as a donor, go to thepursuitofhistory.org. Looking ahead, July 10th, we have History Camp America. Folks who tune in every Thursday night have heard about this. For folks that's new, check out historycamp.org. It is a big event. The first time we've done a History Camp America. For people who are familiar with History Camp, you know about it as an in-person event, which we are eager to restart. But this year, in lieu of doing our regular events in Boston, Philadelphia, Richmond, and so forth, we're doing it online. So History Camp America, July 10th, and also something we've not done before, there is a big box of history loot for people who love history. So all the details, historycamp.org, and if you hurry up and register, you save $30. Next week, we have, that will be May 27th, we have David Blight who will be joining us. He will discuss the escaped slave abolitionist, and I believe one of the most photographed men of his time, Frederick Douglass. He's the author of the Pulitzer Prize winning book about Douglass, and we're excited to have him. We'll look forward to seeing you then. Tom, thanks so much.
Thank you, Lee.